Welcome everyone to the third webinar in our series on integrating with ArchiveSpace. Each webinar in this series will highlight an integration with another application used in archives that ArchiveSpace members have worked on or requested. The webinar series will feature both open source and proprietary systems. Our third webinar in this series will feature an open discussion on ArchiveSpace integration with ArchiveIt, a subscription web archiving service from the Internet Archive that helps organizations to harvest, build, and preserve collections of digital content. In this webinar, Lori Donovan of ArchiveIt will discuss the ArchiveIt ArchiveSpace integration that was developed as part of the Archiving the Websites of Contemporary Composers Mellon Grant, which the Internet Archive collaborated on with New York University. Lori will also share the information about the APIs that underlie the ArchiveIt service and ways that these might be leveraged to integrate metadata from ArchiveIt into ArchiveSpace repositories. After, Dallas Pillen of University of Michigan will present on the Bentley Historical Library's use of ArchiveSpace to manage descriptive metadata about websites captured with ArchiveIt. The presentation will discuss why and how the Bentley decided to manage its descriptive metadata about archive websites in ArchiveSpace, and will provide an overview of a locally developed ArchiveSpace plugin that integrates the two systems to facilitate this work. A discussion will follow. ArchiveSpace users who have integrated with ArchiveIt or are considering integrating with ArchiveIt are encouraged to participate in this discussion. It's in an effort to identify and highlight current community efforts or the potential for community collaboration to encourage integration between the two systems. We will also hold all questions until this discussion at the end. If you type a question into the chat, it will be read and answered during this time. You will notice your microphone and camera were muted when you entered. We ask that you keep your microphone muted until the Q&A session at the end. Your presenters today are Lori Donovan and Dallas Pillen. Lori is the Senior Project Manager for Web Archiving at the Internet Archive. Lori manages ArchiveIt service growth, which includes leading a team of web archivists and technical support staff who provide instruction, guidance, and support for ArchiveIt users, and interfacing with the engineering team to develop new features and functionality for the ArchiveIt service. Lori has a Master's of Information degree from University of Michigan and a Bachelor's degree from Boise State University, where she majored in History and Political Science. Dallas Pillen is the Archivist for Metadata and Digital Curation at the University of Michigan's Bentley Historical Library, where he oversees the library's use of ArchiveSpace, ArchiveIt, Archivematica, and DSpace. He is also a member of the ArchiveSpace Technical Advisory Council and co-chair of the Society of American Archivists Encoded Archival Standards section. Welcome, Lori and Dallas.
Thanks so much, Jessica, and apologies to everyone on the line. I'm getting over a cold, and my voice might be a little scratchy at times. But Jessica, can you confirm that you can hear me at least as well as I can speak?
We can hear you loud and clear.
Great, thanks. Alrighty, so I'm going to go ahead and talk just a little bit about ArchiveIt and web archiving very briefly. I'm assuming that most folks who are here on the line already have at least basic familiarity with ArchiveIt if you're not already an ArchiveIt user. And then I'll talk a little bit about specific integrations that exist or that might be possible based on the APIs that we have in place at with ArchiveIt. So first, a little bit about web archiving and ArchiveIt. You can see here an archived web page in the ArchiveIt Wayback. So the whole goal of web archiving is to capture and preserve websites and make them accessible for historical research or archival purposes. And a little bit about how this works. A user will start by entering websites that they would like to capture in our ArchiveIt user interface, which I'll show briefly in a moment, and dispatching a crawler to go out to the live web and capture the files that make up these target websites. Those files are then stored in the WARC format, which is a standard format for web archiving files. WARC files can be played back in the Wayback software, like you saw in the previous slide, and you can see here. And then a user can browse through those archived websites as though they were browsing the live web. In web archiving, this model shows how it's an iterative process and something that can be refined and developed and managed by librarians and archivists. Just to give you a little peek inside the ArchiveIt Web Application, if you haven't seen it before, this is again, the management interface where subscribers can create collections of websites that they'd like to capture and manage the frequency, the scope, and the metadata for those websites. And public access is very, very important to a large majority of the ArchiveIt users, and presumably anyone who's on the line today is interested in access in some way. So this is just an example of the ArchiveIt Access interface, so public access. This is a collection from NYU, their collection of contemporary composers' websites. And as Jessica mentioned earlier, we worked with NYU, who are ArchiveSpace users, on an integration between ArchiveIt and ArchiveSpace that was part of a grant from the Mellon Foundation, because their goal was to provide pointers out to their collections in ArchiveSpace for some of the composers that they are collecting websites from. So just so you can see here, this is a record for a specific composer that they are collecting on. And you can see that they provide a linkage for the ArchiveSpace page for this collection, and it appears under related archival materials. The link here goes out to ArchiveSpace, and the extent information is pulled in through the API that was developed as part of this project. There's a field within the ArchiveIt administrative interface that allows you to add those the linkages back to the collection that you desire at either the individual website level. So if one specific website is related to content that is described in ArchiveSpace. And then there's also the option to do that at the collection level as well, if the collection is related to an entire collection in ArchiveSpace. And so this is from the other side, you can see that there is information about an archived website that is related to this particular collection as it's listed in the Access interface. The integration that exists currently was developed for a pretty specific use case, and it primarily does the part on the previous slide, which is showing linkages to ArchiveSpace from within the ArchiveIt public site versus the opposite, which is having pointers to ArchiveIt within ArchiveSpace. So Dallas will talk a little bit more about how they've kind of moved information from ArchiveIt into ArchiveSpace from his perspective as well. But what I wanted to talk a little bit more about as well is that there are any number of different ways that that users could utilize the ArchiveIt APIs that exist to integrate information about your collections, whether it be metadata, collecting information, etc., into external services, and in this case, specifically into ArchiveSpace. And just to give you a high-level overview of what kinds of APIs we have available, and then we'll I'll talk specifically about two of them. We have a Wayback API that includes all of the information about the captures of each website that's been captured, so that you could provide information about dates and times of capture externally to within an external service. The search API is full text search, so it allows the integration of full text search results into external websites or services. The work API allows for programmatic downloading of archived of the web archive files. The Metadata API is an OAI PMH feed of just the descriptive metadata within ArchiveIt. And then finally, the Partner API, which is the other API that I'm going to be discussing, is really, it includes all of the information that is displayed within the ArchiveIt management interface. So this runs the gamut from descriptive metadata to technical or preservation metadata. And just to give you a little more information about that, to get into it more specifically, this is the sort of starter access point for that API. We have extensive documentation of the API and of all the things that I've been discussing so far at the link down here in the right-hand corner of the screen. But the Partner API is what fuels this ArchiveIt Web Application. So any of the information that you see displayed in this table, for example, is coming from the Partner API. So you could, it includes information about the websites that you're capturing, the frequency at which they're being captured, whether they are public or private, when they've been crawled, etc. Just to show you an example of how this looks if you're accessing the API via web browser, this is a call from the API that will give you information about the seeds within your account. And you can see information here, and you can choose what format you'd like to see the information in. So you can see it in JSON. And again, you can see for this particular seed URL, you can see some information about it, and you would see any descriptive metadata here as well. You can also get the data out in CSV format if that's more convenient for you, if you prefer to look at the data in that way. And just to mention, in our documentation, there are a number of different sort of starter queries that can get you going, kind of digging into what's really available within the API. The other API that I just want to talk very briefly about is the Wayback API. Which is available at wayback.archiveit.org. And the Wayback API is what fuels the Wayback calendar page, which you can see here. We also, you may have heard the Wayback API referred to as the CDX API. And CDX is just an index of the web archive files that are a part of any collection. So what that allows is it provides an index of each of the dates that a particular URL was captured. And we have, if you're accessing the API directly, you'll see information that looks kind of like this. So if you were looking for this particular URL in the CDX or Wayback API, you would see information about capture dates, format. This is a checksum of the data, as well as the URL itself. And there's a few additional fields that are available in the API as well. And one way that it can be used, and this is a really neat example from one of our partners, they're integrating information from the Wayback API as well as information from the partnered API into a custom-built website for their web archive collections. This is for Princeton Theological Seminary. And you can see the metadata, descriptive metadata about this particular seed or website that they're capturing, as well as from the Wayback API, the capture dates are available in this twirl down. So it's basically a different user interface for the ArchiveIt calendar page. So that was just a little bit of kind of high-level information about current integrations, about APIs that might fuel further integrations. There are references and documentation for all of the things that I covered at bit.ly/ASpace-AIT. And we're really looking forward to hearing more of your questions and ideas. But first, I'm going to turn it over to Dallas to talk a little more about their specific integrations that they've worked on.
All right, Lori or Jessica, could you confirm that you can see my screen and hear me okay?
Yep, can see it and also can hear you.
Wonderful, thank you. All right, yeah, so as Lori mentioned, I'm going to be talking about some specific ArchiveIt and ArchiveSpace integrations that we've implemented at the Bentley Historical Library at the University of Michigan. This presentation will be focused mostly on why we decided to integrate the systems and sort of how we decided how that would work, like what needs were we trying to meet in integrating the two systems, and how do we go about conceptualizing the relationships between the systems. There will be a little bit of information about the specifics and technical details of how the integration was done, but not a whole lot. But there are links to more information in the Google Doc that Lori mentioned. And then I also just want to add a caveat that maybe I don't have to add, but I want to anyways, that this is not meant to be sort of a universally applicable method of integrating these two systems. This was sort of based on some pretty specific, I think, local historical practices and some local needs just on how we were using these systems. But I think the general methodology we used could be extended elsewhere. So just to give a little bit of institutional context for the Bentley Historical Library and all of the systems that we're using to manage our work. I've got a list of a few of them on the screen there. Just wanted to make the point sort of that we've implemented quite a lot of systems since around 2015 on this list. ArchiveSpace, ArchiveIt, ArchiveMatica, Kaltura, and Aeon are all systems that we've started using in the last 4 to 5 years. So there's been a lot of new system implementation here to do a lot of very sort of specific things. And many of these systems, since we've implemented them, we've integrated them with one another in some way, shape, or form. We've tried to implement systems that can be integrated with one another through plugins, APIs, data import and export functionality. It's sort of become a pretty important feature of systems for us. And as part of that, the way we've sort of gone about implementing systems and deciding how we want to integrate them is we've tried to be very intentional about what each system is meant to do. What function does that system serve? What is it built to do? What does it do well? And where does it fit into our workflow? And we found that that has really helped us to identify some of these points where systems can integrate and make our sort of workflows more efficient and just sort of make these systems do what they do really well. So why integrate ArchiveSpace and ArchiveIt? ArchiveSpace, since we've implemented it, has really become our system of record for descriptive and administrative metadata. We've migrated all of our finding aids and accession records and catalog records and all of our other description about our archival collections to ArchiveSpace. And then we've sort of gradually been migrating metadata from some of these disparate other systems that we've had into ArchiveSpace, including some databases that we have to manage description about our audiovisual collections, and then so ArchiveIt migrating our metadata about our web archives seemed like sort of a natural progression of how we were using the system. And then ArchiveIt we use to configure, schedule, run, and perform quality assurance on web captures, and to also provide access to those captures in the Wayback Machine. Those are sort of the essential functions of ArchiveIt for us, and we were using it for a while after we implemented it to create and manage description about web archives, but just due to how we were using the system and how it was sort of fitting into our workflow, we were running into a few challenges related to metadata creation, management, and discovery in ArchiveIt. So that's was sort of some of the inspiration for investigating integrating these two systems. And to give a little bit more detail about some of the challenges we were looking to solve. ArchiveIt does have metadata creation and management functionality sort of out of the box that we were using. Got an image of it on the screen where there's a sort of Dublin core form that you can use to add things like titles, descriptions, subjects, creators, and so on. And we were using it pretty extensively. We've historically, since we started doing web archiving at the Bentley using subscription services in about 2010, have added a good amount of descriptive metadata to the sites that we were capturing. Just about every site that we capture, we try to add a title, description, some subjects, creator, and things like that. And over time, we sort of started to run into just some issues with managing all of that metadata, particularly when it came to websites that were changing their URLs over time. So being the same website, but changing URLs, managing our controlled vocabularies, all of those subjects and agents that we were creating. And as we started implementing more descriptive management systems and or actually concentrating it in ArchiveSpace, we also had just ran into some issues with managing both of those systems, and then also providing access and discovery to our descriptive metadata. I've got some examples of each of those things. So for URL changes over time, this example is the University of Michigan President's website. Used to be at umich.edu/pres, is now at president.umich.edu, but it is still functionally the same website. And because ArchiveIt's metadata management system is seed or URL based, ended up with a lot of duplicate metadata, a lot of metadata that would become sort of out of date as we added new seeds. In order to resolve this, we initially investigated using the grouping functionality in ArchiveIt, which we had some success with, but it was a little bit cumbersome and didn't resolve some of the other issues that we had. And also just want to mention that I know that ArchiveIt is planning on rolling out some improvements to how users can manage descriptive metadata for sites that change URLs over time sometime in 2020. So there might be some additional options at that time. For controlled vocabularies, ArchiveIt's metadata entry screen is it's just the controlled vocabularies are strings associated with seeds, not separate sort of controlled linked entities. On the left, I've got the ArchiveIt metadata entry screen where you can see you just enter terms into a text box, and on the right is ArchiveSpace's agent record for the University of Michigan President's Agent, which is sort of a standalone entity that is linked to a lot of other records. So we were running into issues just with redundant information, different entities of being referred to slightly differently just based on whoever was sort of keying in the metadata. And all of these were also sort of separate from the record that we had created in ArchiveSpace, so we weren't able to see sort of everything that was associated with a given entity in one place. As I mentioned, we implemented ArchiveSpace, so managing, and we were using it to more and more manage our descriptive metadata about our collections. So ArchiveIt was just sort of yet another system that we had to have some guidelines for and train people on, and just it didn't really fit in with the way that we were starting to manage most of our other description. And finally, discovery and access. The University of Michigan Libraries catalog is the system where we provide discovery and access to almost all of our materials. It's where most of our description is discoverable, but a lot of our information about our web archives were not discoverable there. And for a lot of entities, web archives are maybe the only records that we have. For example, a lot of student organizations, they don't have records that they've transferred to us, but we have agreed to capture their websites, and they would go to the catalog and not find any record of us doing that. And we were finding that users weren't really sort of navigating to our ArchiveIt organization page to search for things. It was not super intuitive. It was another siloed system. And for our local use cases, ArchiveIt does have some mechanisms to query ArchiveIt and display search results within other systems, but the library catalog was sort of managed by the University of Michigan Library, which we are a separate entity from, and they were working on some major upgrades to the system at that time, so we just didn't really have the ability to integrate them in that way. So that could have been a different approach that we took, but just given our sort of local needs and context at that time, we started thinking about ArchiveSpace integration. Because as I mentioned, ArchiveSpace is the system of record for our descriptive metadata. It has support for managing multi-level intellectual description, so we figured we could probably find a way to manage descriptive metadata about distinct websites and link the multiple seed URLs that had been associated with that website over time. Has support for managing controlled vocabularies like subjects and agents. Over time, we've integrated ArchiveSpace with various other systems here at the Bentley, including Archivematica, DSpace, and Aeon, where we manage metadata in ArchiveSpace, but either author it in other systems and send it to ArchiveSpace, or share it from ArchiveSpace with these other systems. It is also the source of metadata for our streaming AV access and some of our digitized collections. So we had a lot of experience using ArchiveSpace with other systems where we maybe manage the metadata in ArchiveSpace, but it is discoverable in other places. And then also, sort of most importantly, we thought this would be feasible just due to the fact that ArchiveSpace and ArchiveIt have these system architectures and affordances that facilitate integration. ArchiveSpace has an API to get data in and out of the system. It has a plugin architecture where you can create some local customizations that extend the functionality of the system. And then, as Lori mentioned, there's also the ArchiveIt Partner Metadata API to be able to sort of query the metadata that you have in your ArchiveIt account to get data sort of out of the system. So this is an example of the sort of the University of Michigan President website seed that I've shown on a couple of slides, but through that Partner Metadata API, and in particular, I've narrowed it down to some of the relevant fields to us. So when we were first thinking about ArchiveIt and ArchiveSpace integration, that was when this Partner Metadata API was sort of being released and made available to partners, and I was experimenting with it a little bit and just found that you could get all of this description about your collections pretty easily. You can get information about the collection that a seed is part of, any groups that have been associated with it, sort of the crawl frequency, whether it's publicly accessible or a private seed, just all of this different information that would allow you to characterize different seed URLs and begin to sort of reconcile and group together the metadata. So it sort of proved that this that integrating these two systems would be sort of feasible. So after we decided to pursue this integration between ArchiveSpace and ArchiveIt, we wanted to be sort of, as I mentioned before, sort of very intentional about what are we trying to achieve, what workflows and use cases are we trying to satisfy here, what roles do we want the different systems to play. So these are sort of the use cases that we had in mind when pursuing this integration, was to continue to use ArchiveIt for the function that we like the essential function that it served for us, which was to manage the technical aspects of adding, scoping, running, scheduling, and evaluating crawls. We also wanted to migrate our existing descriptive metadata from ArchiveIt to ArchiveSpace, because we wanted to start creating and managing description in ArchiveSpace. We wanted to have that legacy description there. As part of that migration, wanted to figure out how to model distinct seed URLs that corresponded to the same website, and also reconcile controlled access points, so do some cleanup and normalization, and also match them against existing subjects and agents in ArchiveSpace where we could. We wanted to have a way to continue to update ArchiveSpace with new seed URLs from ArchiveIt, because we presumed we would continue to use ArchiveIt to add new seed URLs and wanted to be able to create description for that in ArchiveSpace. We also wanted a way to get metadata from ArchiveSpace to ArchiveIt, because regardless of whether where we were authoring that description, we still wanted it to be updated and discoverable through the ArchiveIt public access interface. And finally, we wanted to leverage this opportunity, all this sort of metadata cleanup and management enhancement, to just generally increase the discoverability of our web archive. So we didn't want to integrate these systems and find a better way to manage metadata just sort of for its own sake. We wanted it to, the main goal here was to make this metadata sort of more accessible in some of our other systems, so that our users would have more awareness of our web archives. So we already accomplished the first goal, because we were using ArchiveIt to manage all of the technical aspects of adding, scoping, running, scheduling, and evaluating crawls. Then our first step in, our next step actually in integrating these systems, was to migrate our existing metadata from ArchiveIt to ArchiveSpace. And this is where that partner metadata API really came in handy. Using that partner metadata API, I was able to characterize all of our seeds using some combination of the seed status, how often we were capturing it, any groups we had associated with it, names of creators, titles, and capture dates, to sort of figure out which seeds corresponded to the same URL, which one was maybe the current seed URL, which were some historical URLs. And most of that information was available via the partner metadata API, and then that Wayback API, or the CDX API that Lori also mentioned, was used to find capture dates. Once we had characterized those seed URLs, try to do a good bit of metadata cleanup on it before migrating to ArchiveSpace. So grouping seed URLs for the same sites, deduplicating information, reconciling existing subjects and access points using the ArchiveSpace API, so to find out subjects that we've added in ArchiveSpace or in ArchiveIt, do we also have an existing record for that in ArchiveSpace to avoid duplication, use tools like OpenRefine to normalize remaining access points that over time had sort of become a little messy. And then once we had all of that sort of cleaned up metadata, we created EADs programmatically for each of the Bentley's 8 ArchiveIt collections, and then imported those into ArchiveSpace. And the reason why this was done was mostly a very pragmatic decision, that we had done a lot of EAD migration into ArchiveSpace and had a lot of scripts and methods for doing that sort of efficiently and with minimal error, and knew what we would get. So it was just a proven and familiar method for ArchiveSpace migration here at the Bentley. This is are some screenshots of how we decided to model our descriptive metadata for these ArchiveIt collections in ArchiveSpace. So to accomplish the goals of managing multiple seeds for the same website and managing controlled entities. So the data model that we decided on ultimately was to have one ArchiveSpace resource per ArchiveIt collection. So we have 8 separate collections in ArchiveIt. So we have 8 ArchiveSpace resources for managing this descriptive metadata for web archives. Within each of those resources, there is one sort of top-level component per website, and that component is where we add all of our descriptive metadata, like the title, creators and subjects, any descriptions, our abstracts, and sort of all of the metadata that applies to the website as a sort of intellectual entity rather than to a URL at a given point in time. And then each of those components has one or more child components per seed URL. So per URL over time with capture dates that we've captured over time and links to digital objects to access the archived websites in the Wayback Machine. So on the left is a screenshot of sort of the ArchiveSpace resource hierarchy. In the middle is a description for an individual website. Again, that example of the University of Michigan president website. And then on the right is a record for an individual seed, where we've also added links to the ArchiveIt administrative interface to be able to access the seed in ArchiveIt. So we migrated description from ArchiveIt to ArchiveSpace, modeled websites with multiple seed URLs, and reconciled access points. So the next step in our integration was to find a way to continue to add new seed URLs to ArchiveSpace. And this step is really the one where the most obvious sort of integration is happening, where the systems are sort of talking to each other at some point in time. We wanted to be able to add new seed URLs to ArchiveSpace without having to navigate to a resource, manually create a couple of archival objects, and all of that. We wanted to try to limit those steps just to make this as seamless as possible and as easy to manage going forward. So in order to do that, I developed a local ArchiveSpace plugin, which is available on GitHub and linked to here and in the Google Doc that Lori mentioned. And this plugin, among other things, uses the ArchiveIt Partner Metadata API. It takes a URL to a seed in the ArchiveIt administrative interface, and then queries the Partner Metadata API to grab some basic metadata, and then creates an archival object associated with the relevant ArchiveSpace resource based on some minimal configuration that you have to do in your ArchiveSpace configuration file. And then from there, it's a simple drag and drop to associate the new archival object with any existing site level description, or you can create new site level description and then drag and drop the archival object from there. So it allows us to go to ArchiveIt, add a new seed, run a couple of test crawls, maybe add some scoping rules, manage all those technical aspects of running and scheduling the crawl, and then go over to ArchiveSpace, import the seed, and then create our description there. So developed a way to update ArchiveSpace with new seed URLs. In order to update ArchiveIt with metadata from ArchiveSpace, this is an example of taking advantage of another one of the sort of integrable features of both ArchiveSpace and ArchiveIt. At the moment, we're just using the ArchiveSpace API to query the metadata, the description that we've created for our archived websites in ArchiveSpace, and then just generating a spreadsheet that we upload using the ArchiveIt bulk metadata upload feature. So this is something where we're sort of taking advantage of some other features and of ArchiveIt to just easily export some metadata from ArchiveSpace and sync it up with our seeds in ArchiveIt. So we've developed a way to update ArchiveIt with metadata from ArchiveSpace. And then finally, to leverage this opportunity to increase the discoverability of our web archives. Now that this metadata is managed in ArchiveSpace, we can export it in all sorts of different structured ways to share it with other systems. So another thing that the plugin that I developed does is adds an option to export a MARC record that is structured according to sort of the needs of what we would need to be able to import it into the library catalog that we're using. So we can export this MARC XML, import it into the catalog, and now those web archives are discoverable alongside all of our other collections. So as part of this project, we added catalog records for something like 1,200 websites that we had been capturing in ArchiveIt that up until now had been sort of not as discoverable as we would have liked. So we've leveraged this opportunity to increase the discoverability of our web archives. So our final workflow, as I've sort of walked through, is that we add a new seed URL to ArchiveIt, perform all of the testing and quality assurance there, import that seed URL into ArchiveSpace, create or update description, and then once we're sort of done, or from time to time, we export a spreadsheet to update metadata in ArchiveIt, create a MARC record to update our catalog, and then for ongoing maintenance, we do seed scoping, crawl scheduling, and quality assurance in ArchiveIt, and update descriptive metadata in ArchiveSpace. So we are allowing systems to do sort of what they do best. We've allowing ArchiveSpace to manage descriptive metadata, ArchiveIt to manage scheduling and running crawls. We're leveraging some of the features of these various systems, like APIs, plugins, bulk metadata, import and export, and other features to manage this work. Some future plans that I have in mind for improving this process include continuing to update capture dates with the Wayback Capture Data Index API. There's not an automated way to do that at the moment in the plugin, and also add the ability to just export a spreadsheet directly from ArchiveSpace to upload to ArchiveIt, just also streamline the process a little bit. And then some future possibilities that would be maybe nice to have someday are to, would love to be able to update metadata in ArchiveIt using the partner metadata API, which would require the API to have some write functionality. Currently, you can only get metadata out. Would be nice to be able to integrate ArchiveIt search results into the University of Michigan Library search interface directly, and rather than having to sort of export catalog records. And then we'll also be looking to reevaluate the current process when ArchiveIt rolls out its planned enhancements to the ability to link related seeds. So this is not meant to be sort of like a forever solution. This was sort of just making it a little bit better and easier to manage our metadata in the way that we wanted to, given the current functionality of these systems. So, thanks. Feel free to email me. I've got my contact info on the screen, and also have linked to the ArchiveSpace plugin and our description guidelines, which include sort of our user guidelines on how to use this integration. And both of those are also in that Google Doc that I think Carl has shared.
Wonderful. Thank you both so much. That was really great. And in addition to the links that you just saw and in the chat, I'll also make sure that the links are also included as part of the webinar announcement with the recording and everything. So those links will be kept as part of the recording as well. So you'll be able to find that online. We'll now open the floor to questions or comments. Feel free to unmute yourself at this point and offer up your comment or question, or you can just type it into the chat. I will read all of the messages that come through the chat, so you don't have to worry about the microphone or talking over anyone if you prefer to do it that way. We currently don't have any message or questions in the chat. So I actually have a question for Dallas. So from the initial decision to integrate to this maintenance stage that you're in now, about how long did that take?
I think I worked on it over a summer maybe. So it was maybe like a month or two. It was not like the only project I was sort of working on at the time. It was honestly a bit of a side project to sort of experiment with this and see if we could find a way to manage this better. So I think it was maybe a couple weeks of active work, I think.
Well, you said it wasn't a forever solution, but it's a pretty elegant one. Please feel free to talk over me, people, or type in questions. But I will. So Dallas, if you had this project to do again, I know that you listed future possibilities and things you're thinking about. But if you had to do it again, or you're talking to someone who's thinking of starting, is there anything you would have done differently, or any lessons that you learned?
Well, definitely throughout the process, there were a couple of like little side tracks along the way that I didn't really mention. I sort of just mentioned the final way that we figured out how to do this, but there were a couple of little side experiments that I took, like trying to just directly create catalog records from ArchiveIt. It's something we had done when we were using the California Digital Library in maybe 2014, creating some just exporting description from there and converting it into some Mark XML and uploading it to our catalog, trying some of the grouping functionality in ArchiveIt. So I was trying some of these different pathways that ended up not really being super successful. So I might have, probably if I would have thought from the beginning that we're using ArchiveSpace to do a lot of this other work, if I had sort of approached it from trying to integrate these systems and rather than shoehorn some of this metadata from ArchiveIt into these different other different things that I thought would be maybe easier and quicker, it might have sped the process up a little bit and made it more successful from the get-go. So it was one of those things that started as like, oh, I'll just do this little project to group these seeds together, and then turned into this bigger project eventually. So just some better planning from the start might have been good.
And always use ArchiveSpace. That's what I heard. We do have some questions in the chat now. Lori, can you give an example of how the search API might be used?
Hi there. Sure, I absolutely can. So there are a couple of different ways that folks have used the search API. So basically, one of the ways that our partners at NIARC, which is the New York Art Resources Consortium, have integrated the ArchiveIt full text search results using this API into their Primo discovery layer. So it's sort of like federated search. And so full text search results show up alongside other search results from other types of materials that they hold. And then the other example I was going to share was from that Princeton Theological Seminary site that I showed sort of the twirl down with the capture dates and the metadata that they pulled over. They also have a search box on their website that that utilizes the search API. So we have text, or we have a snippet of code in the help site, the ArchiveIt Help Center, that is just an easy way to plop a search box into whatever site you'd like, and it searches whatever collections you designate, and the results show up, or you can use the search API to make the results appear in your page versus sending people back to the ArchiveIt interface for the search results. So some people really care about those results showing up within their own website versus pointing back to ArchiveIt itself.
Thanks, Lori. I think this question is for Dallas. Is the mark XML export at the archival object rather than resource or series level?
Yeah, it's at the level of the website description. So the sort of first level archival object that has all the descriptive metadata, and then the export includes all of that, and then some entries for each of the seeds with that point to the Wayback machine.
Awesome, thanks. We've got a lot of questions in the chat now. So going back to Lori's earlier comments, here's the short HTML code for putting a web archive search box anywhere you want. So that is in the chat, and that will be included if you're watching this recording in the future as well with the recording. This question is for anyone, but I know Lori will be able to answer it. Has anyone gotten the NYU plugin to work with recent versions of ArchiveSpace? We've tried some testing and haven't been able to produce any JSON response with the URL needed for ArchiveIt.
I know that there were some issues a while back that we were fielding with folks from NYU where there was an issue with something having been written very, very specifically for their use case, where like one of their access layers was like hard-coded in the plugin. So I think that was fixed, but I don't know if anyone else is using the plugin currently. So I'd love to hear from anyone on the line if they are, if they've had success with it or not. We can obviously provide support for the part of it that is, the ArchiveIt website, like, adding the code or adding, or, how it displays on the public site. But as far as the plugin itself goes, NYU is definitely the one to manage it. And I know that they have been at least somewhat responsive to comments in the GitHub for the plugin.
Yeah, and so there have been some responses in the chat too. So Joe has pointed out there are a few open issues on the GitHub, so people are reporting issues on the GitHub.
Okay.
And then Laura, we couldn't get the NYU plugin to work either. And then, hi everyone, this is Nicole from NYU. I don't think we're supporting it anymore, but I can follow up on it. Okay. So maybe, yeah, Nicole, if you could follow up on that and potentially send something out to some listservs. Let's see, let's move back up the chat. For Dallas, are you connecting archive websites with existing physical collections? For example, if you have a physical archival collection and associated finding aid code, for the Office of the President, does its finding aid or catalog record point to, mention, or link to websites in ArchiveIt?
Yes, yeah, we do. We try to, if we have a collection that we have a finding aid for and are capturing the website in ArchiveIt, try to add it as just an archival object to the finding aid. And for that, we have historically not done that as often as we should, just from the time when sort of the web archiving part of our operation was a little bit more separate from our description and finding aid creation part of our operations here. But we do have a lot of finding aids that link to archived websites. In those cases, it's just a simple sort of link to, we say it's, archived website of the University of Michigan President, and link to the page in the Wayback Machine. We don't include as much essentially item level description for that in our finding aid. We rely more on the aggregate description. So that is one thing that this sort of integration work in this plugin does not, it did not factor, it was not sort of a priority at the time, was sort of trying to do a little bit more reconciliation, and I think there's probably a lot of stuff where we could not worry about describing them websites at such a granular level in ArchiveIt and just take advantage of the aggregate description from the finding aid. But that would be a sort of bigger cleanup project that just wasn't part of this at the time. But we do link to websites from a lot of our finding aids, and then also have a lot of websites that we capture that we don't have a related collection for. And then I also see the next question, it looks like was for me, about we have a way to update description like dates in ArchiveSpace as we keep crawling seed. So right now I just from time to time use like a Python script to query ArchiveSpace and query the CDX API and update those. That's something that I think could be automated a lot more, and maybe would be something that would definitely get included in like the next round of development if I end up having time to set aside to work on this again at some point, would be having a more regular and automated update of those capture dates.
Thanks, Dallas. We don't have any more specific questions in the chat. We do have another post from Carl for more direct access to the search API. There's another link there, going back to that question about search. And it is almost the top of the hour, so I do know people will have to hop off probably anyway. But if anyone would like to post a last minute question in the chat, we are still here and I am still reading questions. Or if anyone would like to unmute themselves to contribute comment, please feel free.
I just wanted to say thanks to everyone for coming, and also to feel free to reach out afterwards to ArchiveIt staff. You can always submit a feature request, or otherwise send ideas our way. We'd be happy to help support any use cases that you guys might have, and talk about what it might look like to work together on further integrations, because we think this is an area that's very important.
Thank you, Lori, and thank you, Dallas. Thank you both for presenting today and for being willing to sort of let everyone peek under the hood a little bit. We don't have any more questions in the chat, so with that, I think I'll just tell everyone good day, and thank you everyone for coming. And our next webinar in this series will be on integration with Aviary, and that will be January 15th at 2 p.m. Eastern. Thank you, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.
Yeah, thanks, everyone.